Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity. I've read and internalized the report on the lowering costs. The report, Mr. Speaker, has given us the background very well. But I think the underscoring principle of this report, Mr. Speaker, sir, with all due respect, was like a skirt that was long enough to cover essentials, but short enough to arouse curiosity on what is happening in the energy sector, Mr. Speaker. The Speaker, it is very unfortunate because the beginning of the report is overwhelming, but the recommendations are underwhelming. Mr. Speaker, I have expected a earth-shaking and radical, atomic, Mr. Speaker, recommendations. The committee has done a fantastic job in research, good work, everything, but Mr. Speaker, when you come at the tail end is where there is a failure. It is like shooting in the dark. And we don't know, because I would have expected Kenyans who are following this motion, Mr. Speaker, would really have wanted to know, Mr. Speaker, what ails the issue of electricity? What makes it expensive? We have been told. So what is the way forward? So, Speaker, on the recommendations, that even other recommendations, and that is why I agree with some senators, Mr. Speaker, who said we need an implementation committee to follow up on the implementation of some of these recommendations that we have made, Mr. Speaker. This report, Mr. Speaker, while I allowed the committee for sitting long hours, doing the research, the recommendation fell short of the target, Mr. Speaker. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, the committee should relook at some of the recommendations, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have had colleagues, Mr. Speaker, talking about ending monopoly of Kenya Power and Lighting and Company. Mr. Speaker, and you know tomorrow we are doing elections of Law Society of Kenya, tomorrow morning. And I want to wish all candidates all the best for Law Society of Kenya elections. I can see the chairperson emeritus of the LSK chair of the Kenyan chapter. He later became the emeritus chair of East Africa Law Society. He sits on the senior councils, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I wanted to make...
Senator Kisumu County.
For the member for Nandi to mislead the House, I was not a chairman of the East African Law Society. I was a president, Mr. Speaker, sir. That should go on record. I was a president of the East African Law Society, and I was a vice president of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. I'm a very serious litigation lawyer.
Senator Cherargei, kindly just you are seasoned registry retired. You have been around for some time.
Mr. Speaker, no, but you know it was just to capture...
Just stick to relevance and talk about the energy sector.
Speaker, my apologies, Mr. Speaker, to my teacher and then senior counsel. He should be the president, not the chairman. But when you go to China, chairman is a very respectable person. So be using interchangeably when you travel. So, Speaker, I was just making a point that under the fourth schedule, because I was taught by him the constitutional law, under the fourth schedule of 2010 constitution, counties have power to generate electricity, even gas reticulation, Mr. Speaker. So I've had my colleagues saying we end monopoly of Kenya Power. The monopoly of Kenya Power was ended, Mr. Speaker, the day 2010 Constitution was promulgated, Mr. Speaker. Because under fourth schedule on the functions of county governments, the counties have power to generate electricity, Mr. Speaker. Individuals have power to generate. What we are having are the cartels who issue license. The Energy Act, Mr. Speaker, which has not been conformed to be the same standard, Mr. Speaker, as was envisaged in Constitution 2010, Mr. Speaker. So I want to put it record to Kenyans who have not read the Constitution, Mr. Speaker. The issue of generation of electricity, Vihiga can generate, Nandi can generate, individuals can generate, Mr. Speaker. The only problem is the regulatory regime, Mr. Speaker, that has been frustrated by all incidents, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and therefore I want to really say that we can generate electricity. You can generate electricity, Mr. Speaker, at any given point, but the question is, these regulations that have been delayed, the issue of Energy Act has not been reviewed, Mr. Speaker, to reflect the intent, the purpose, because the purposive interpretation of fourth schedule on definitions of functions of county governments, Mr. Speaker, should have ensured that you can do caste reticulation, you can sue electricity generation of electricity, Mr. Speaker. So there is no monopoly of Kenya Power. Mr. Speaker, that is the whole point. The issue is, number two, Mr. Speaker, because I have only 5 points, is we need to move from hydroelectricity, generation of using hydro to generate electricity, Mr. Speaker. We now need to discuss an option of nuclear energy. I know that's a very contentious issue, Mr. Speaker. We nowadays have nuclear authority so that we can have energy sufficiency, Mr. Speaker. We cannot talk about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, Mr. Speaker, without, Mr. Speaker, without looking at the sufficiency of energy. Nowadays, Mr. Speaker, there is a common saying on social media among youth that when it rains, electricity in a hammer. What they say, when it rains, it's like they are removing clothes on the cloth line, because when it rains, the electricity disappears, Mr. Speaker. My palatial residence, Mr. Speaker, in Mosoriat, whenever I'm home, Mr. Speaker, you know some of us don't live at homes. We live at residences, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I experience continuous interruption of even weeks and days, Mr. Speaker, of lack of electricity. And I am somebody in the society. What about the ordinary Wanjikus who cannot access Kenya Power, who cannot call Kenya Power, Mr. Speaker? Yet in fact, the faulty generators, transformers, the faulty transformers, Mr. Speaker, I know there is some region in this country where there are faulty generators in the other sector. I'm talking about Kenya Power, Mr. Speaker, EPLC generators, Mr. Speaker, is faulty. And no one has given us an answer of what happened to those faulty generators, Mr. Speaker, up to today. I expected this report to address the faulty generators. I have a number of primary schools in Nandi County who have always suffered because of faulty generators. Even next to my house, Mr. Speaker, I can't access electricity. Nowadays, Mr. Speaker, I'm moving even my lighting to go to solar energy because the Kenya Power and Company does not have sufficient energy, Mr. Speaker, to supply. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we must as a country, if we don't see hydro electricity, Mr. Speaker, we need to move to nuclear energy. We need to move to nuclear. We have necessary legislation. We are members of international agencies of nuclear energy. I know, sir, the reason, Mr. Speaker, we have been very cautious is because of international challenges and perception that nuclear energy has not been very important. Mr. Speaker, number 3 is I expected the committee to direct Kenya Revenue Authority to zero rate all solar products, Mr. Speaker. Even as the president is pushing that we plant more than 10 billion trees, or is it 15 billion trees, Mr. Speaker, we need to zero rate the issue of solar products, Mr. Speaker, so that we achieve 2 things. One is to create competitiveness to Kenya Power and Lighting Company, and number 2 is the clean energy, Mr. Speaker, which has been looked at under the climate change. You know that our president, Mr. Speaker, our party leader and the leader of this country is pushing for clean energy. How can we show goodwill if we do not zero rate solar products, Mr. Speaker? So I want to challenge, Mr. Speaker, that we zero rate the solar panel or solar products, Mr. Speaker, so that it becomes easy to access, cheap. Mr. Speaker, when you go nowadays to villages, you get our people have bought a battery and a small solar panel to listen a radio for lighting and a few things, Mr. Speaker. So we need to make it cheaper so that our Kenyans can access, and I'm happy nowadays, Mr. Speaker, you can access solar products within the country, but we need to zero rate. So I would have expected that the Committee of Energy should have ordered Kenya Revenue Authority to zero rate all solar products for easy access and clean energy in the spirit of President William Ruto's agenda on the climate change, Mr. Speaker. Number 4, Mr. Speaker, I would have expected, I know they have ordered a special audit, but they should have been specific. Mr. Speaker, as the Vice Chair, and I know you know my work at the County Public Accounts, because you have been attending our sessions, especially when Meru County Governor appears, Mr. Speaker. There are different forms of special audit. I would have expected the committee to order one audit, forensic audit, number 1, because of issues of impropriety, Mr. Speaker. Number 2, information technology software, Mr. Speaker, audit. We need to be told these meters that we use, the payments, the systems that we use, has it been audited? Mr. Speaker, we need an audit report of IT software that is being used, Mr. Speaker, by the Kenya Power and Lighting Company, because there were allegations of corruption years back, Mr. Speaker. That is number 2 audit. Number 3 audit, Mr. Speaker, is on the audit of governance. We need to be told whether Kenya Power Lighting Company and other agencies, IPRA, KenGen, are being run within the governance under the Company Act, Cap 48 laws of Kenya, Mr. Speaker. Though I didn't see that, I hope I would have expected the entire Committee of Energy to be taking notes, because I'm making serious submissions that will change the intent and the character of this report, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the issue of EPRA role, Mr. Speaker. You saw the other day what happened in Embakasi, Mr. Speaker. EPRA, I'm told, you know, EPRA and some of the rogue DCI officers normally collude and go and close gas plants here in Ngara, Bungoma, Eldoret, among other cities, and among other towns in this country, Mr. Speaker. It is a collusion. In fact, the committee report should have recommended cleanup of IPRA, because the deaths and lives that was seen in loss in Embakasi is because we were being told, and I'm told the matter has been deferred to a later date, here in Embakasi the people who were arrested out of criminal like culpability and negligence, Mr. Speaker, this was regulation. There is a regulatory protocol, IPRA, Mr. Speaker. We don't want to see IPRA only when they are adding 1 shilling or removing 1 shilling when they are selling diesel or petrol. There is more than the IPRA, Mr. Speaker. So Energy and Products Regulation Authority, Mr. Speaker, must be relooked at. I would have expected that within 90 days, Mr. Speaker, he ordered structural governance reorganization of IPRA, Mr. Speaker, so that we don't see nowadays, Mr. Speaker, you saw the former MD was arrested taking 600,000 shillings sometimes back. He went on to become a member of parliament. I know you know the name because you were with him in the last session at the lower house in the National Assembly, where he had to give out 600 to have petrol station be approved. Yet we see fuel being sold adulterated, Mr. Speaker. On the corridors, these major highways, Mr. Speaker, from Mombasa to Malaba, you see adulterated fuel being sold. But EPRA is only appearing to give us pricing and not doing their job. Even here in Kabrengo, here interchange of Kakamega, Luandeti, here along all the way to Mombasa, Mr. Speaker, you find adulterated fuel being sold, Mr. Speaker. There is compliance, Mr. Speaker, that needs to be relooked at. So EPRA role, the committee should. Number 5, Mr. Speaker, is on IPP's agreement, independent power producers. Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised, perturbed, and shocked, Mr. Speaker, the way I was shocked that one of the leaders in this country wanted to be the AU chair. I'm also shocked by this suggestion. Mr. Speaker, in the independent power producers, I know one in Eldoret, I know a number, Mr. Speaker, personally. Mr. Speaker, out of conflict of interest, I don't do that business, so I want to be categorical. Mr. Speaker, it is very unfortunate that the committee should have recommended that the contracts which are very expensive, that the final pricing, Mr. Speaker, is being given to the consumer. Under law, Mr. Speaker, even a title deed, if you acquire a title under the Land Law Act, and my professor of land law on conveyancing, Professor Tom Ogenda, will tell you, Mr. Speaker, this, that if a title is acquired through misrepresentation or by fraud, that title can be cancelled. Are you proud of me, Mwalimu? So, Mr. Speaker, that is, I would have expected on these contracts, Mr. Speaker, that we need to relook and order cancellation, review, renegotiation of this contract, Mr. Speaker, so that we save Kenyans. How can a local company be selling power to a local company using dollars, Mr. Speaker? It's very unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. We must relook because, Mr. Speaker, these are the issues that continue to undermine the cheap electricity in this republic, Mr. Speaker. So I want to agree and I want to call upon the committee, Mr. Speaker, to still look at this. Let us know, I know their worry was that if they order cancellation or review or renegotiation of the contract because of fraud or misrepresentation, Mr. Speaker, maybe they would have done a foul of court jurisdiction in terms of their job, Mr. Speaker. But the contract law is very clear, Mr. Speaker, even in other aspects and other jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the issue of 40 billion plus or approximately that is being owed to Kenya Power, Mr. Speaker, I would have expected Kenya Power to show proof of recovery process of these debts. I saw, Mr. Speaker, Nairobi City County owes Kenya Power more than 2 billion. But Kenya Power has never showed us proof to show how they are recovering that debt. Mr. Speaker, even if I owe you or you owe me loan, before you move to court, you must show that you have sent auctioneers, you have shown intention to collect, Mr. Speaker. So there should have been a process, Mr. Speaker, to show that there is recovery of that debt, Mr. Speaker. They should have been proved, Mr. Speaker, so that we have a tide to ensure that there is recovery process, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the Ketraco, the second final point, Mr. Speaker, is they have known, Mr. Speaker, I know of Lesos transmission line from Chemase to there is old lines that need to be replaced. Mr. Speaker, around Lesos, my people have never been compensated by Ketraco, Mr. Speaker. Yet there are lines and wave lifts. We must ensure that these wave lifts, Mr. Speaker, are being paid properly, Mr. Speaker, going into the future. So, Mr. Speaker, we don't want to go to court. The senior councils, both of them are here, Mr. Speaker, but we don't want to go to court. We want Ketraco to pay, Mr. Speaker. We want Ketraco to pay Kenyans who their compensation that is being read, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, finally on electricity last mile is I want to agree that most of these homes, Mr. Speaker, let us ensure Kenya Power ensure last mile conductivity, especially in our villages. Mr. Speaker, where you come from and I come from is predominantly agriculture. We need electricity, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we use properly, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, this is work in progress. I don't want to say this is an end in itself, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy that in terms of regulations and Energy Act, I've seen Senior Counsel Senator Okongo Mungeni, Eric, Mr. Speaker, trying to on this issue of the law, regulations and the law, Mr. Speaker. And I want to ask him tomorrow to support one of his voters, Edna Arati, in becoming the general member of LSK tomorrow elections. Mr. Speaker, I thank you with those many remarks. I say this is a work in progress. Mr. Speaker, that is improved, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Senators. We have visiting teachers and students from Kisima Girls in Samburu County. In the public gallery, we have 52 students accompanied by 4 teachers from Kisima Girls in Samburu County who are undertaking an education visit in the Senate. Honorable Senators, in our ancient tradition of receiving and welcoming visitors to Parliament, I extend a warm welcome to them, and on behalf of the Senate and on my own behalf, wish them a fruitful visit. Thank you. Senator Ezena, from my from my